Hello and welcome to VeritasPopuli, Truth for the People. I'm your host and producer of the show, Dan Meredith. On VeritasPopuli, we explore many different areas: historical, political, spiritual, cultural. We believe that the truth is like a precious metal, that no matter how hard you rub it, it only gets brighter. Today we are honored to have three special guests with us. Pam Addington is a family court judge from Hardin County, Kentucky. Connie Reguli is a Tennessee practicing attorney who practices in the area of family law. And Denise Hobbs is the licensed social worker and executive director of the Center for Family Development, who has offices throughout Middle Tennessee. Welcome, ladies, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Dan.
Good to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about the American family. You know, in times past, people looked at the family like the Leave It to Beaver family. And you had Ward and June and this perfect family, all except for Eddie Haskell. But we'll leave him out.
Right.
But you had mom and dad and the kids, and everything seemed to be wonderful. And now you sort of roll forward 20, 30, 40 years, and the family seems to be falling apart. We're going to look today at what's happened. What are the causes? What are some of the solutions? And what do you all see? We have a judge, we have an attorney, and then we have someone who works with families every day in adoption placement and counseling and things like that. What's going on with the family today that you all see?
Well, Dan, thank you for having us here today, and you really have quite of an interesting mix because other than this setting, the twain should never meet in a discussion. So thank you for being so brave to do that. But you know, as a family law attorney for 20 years, I have seen huge changes over the past 20 years, and it seems to become more of a hostile environment once anything becomes involved with the legal system, particularly with children. So, you know, there are so many things that we need to change, and we need to really start looking at, we sort of use the colloquial term of best interest of the child, and yet it's almost become a rote saying without really getting down to breaking down what do we need to apply, how do we need to take care of children so that when they grow up, they have healthy relationships.
Right, okay. So what are your thoughts, Pam?
Well, of course, I was an attorney 20 years before I became a judge, and I've been a family court judge now for 12. And I don't recall exactly the year that in Kentucky the law was changed to irreconcilable differences to get a divorce, but at one point in time you had to establish grounds. There had to be fault, such as adultery or mental cruelty, physical abuse, things of that nature. But we haven't had that for a very long time. And of course some people believe that with just the advent of alleging irreconcilable differences, that's really made it too easy for people to get divorces. There's some good things about that as a judge and as an attorney. That only, as Connie was saying, it made it more adversarial. I think once you made the decision to get a divorce, if you had to allege some sort of fault and prove it, because then you have the litany of the private investigators that are coming into court and really throwing mud at that party. So it's eliminated a lot of the ugliness and a lot of the nastiness that you would have traditionally otherwise seen in court before the advent of irreconcilable differences. But through the years, I think that has made it much more lax in people's minds, that it may be when they go into the marriage knowing that, well, if it doesn't really work out, divorce is an easy thing, maybe expensive financially, but as far as getting it's a lot easier to get a divorce now than it was, let's say, 35, 40 years ago when you had the shows like Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah. You know, we've got a lot of different things we could look at here, but divorce is one of them. It's easy in, easy out. And as you said, I've been through a divorce myself, and it's much easier if you can just say, okay, we're out, and you don't have to. I think in Tennessee, and Connie, you're involved in this, but as I remember, unless the laws have changed in Tennessee, there's, I don't know, 12, 14, 15 different reasons to get a divorce, and one of them is just irreconcilable differences. That's the easy one.
Right.
Because that way you just say, I don't like you, you don't like me, we're out. Otherwise, if you choose one of the others, then you have to go to court, and then that's where, as Pam said, that's where the mudslinging, that's where you've got to prove something. Otherwise, you're just out, which makes it easy. And that in the old days it was harder, but it was harder on everyone. So then there's good and there's bad with the whole thing. But that's the divorce issue we can talk about.
Well, and let's just face it. People go into a marriage unprepared.
Yeah.
People have children unprepared, okay? So they don't really know what they're doing when they get involved in this. And there are, very few marriages have really planned, have done spiritual planning, have done economic planning, have done family planning, and really looked at it as a long-term business, so to speak.
Yeah.
So they're going in inexperienced, and they just have conflicts. And so, I mean, it's just true. It's the way it is. We're not living in the world we did 100 years ago, where it was almost necessary to be in a couple, because you would have a farmer and you would have, the household, the head of the household. We just don't live in that kind of world. Women don't need to be married to a man to change their oil. They can stop at Jiffy Lube. So, that we're just in a totally different culture, and the dynamics of what people know or what they plan for in getting into a marriage it's just not there. I mean, that's one of the big mistakes I think that we're making with our young people growing up. We're not even really teaching them about what that healthy relationship is supposed to look like. Now, I know that's really kind of stepping back as far as, instead of just talking about divorce and children and marriage and family, it's like, what are we doing preparing going forward into the marriage relationship?
Sure. Now, Denise, you're a licensed counselor, so this might be in your area as far as this. What do you see as when you come in contact with families that are having difficulties, what do you see as far as people being prepared and the problems that they have?
Well, I think what happens, especially in a divorce, we talk about irreconcilable differences. Well, for children, that totally, I mean, there's no irreconcilable differences with children. I mean, we talk about how easy it is to get a divorce. Well, in Tennessee, the divorce rate, is steadily climbing, and yet the marriage rate is declining. So people are living together, but they're not, they're still living together, they're having children, but they're just not getting married. That doesn't solve the problem. I think people think it solves the problem. Men and women say, well, I'll just live together. But the truth is, you live together and you have children, that you're still a family. And I think we've lost the whole concept of what truly is a family. Family is a mother and a father and children. One of the things Connie talked about, the fact that people are not prepared. They're not prepared. They're not prepared to be parents, and they're not really prepared for a divorce as well. In Tennessee, the parenting law, there's a parenting law that came into effect in 2001, I think it was. And I think, Pam, in Kentucky, there's also a similar law, and I think Kentucky actually does a much better job with it than we're doing in Tennessee. But in the parenting law, you're supposed to go to a parenting class once you file for divorce, or once there's a divorce pending. Tennessee's not doing a really good job, I don't think, of monitoring that. The judges are allowing folks to go ahead and get a divorce, and then as an afterthought, go to the parenting class. And I think that's the whole problem with parenting, is where it's kind of an afterthought. You get married, or you don't get married, but you have children, but you really don't think and plan through. The spiritual component of it, again, is seeking to do the best you can for your children, seeking God. Again, we're not really prepared, and I think that's truly what's happening with our families, is we're not really preparing in so many ways. So
yeah, I went to a family class, a husband and wife marriage development class, years ago, but it was by a couple of guys, counselors, Burkina and Faulkner, and I remember one of the guys stood up and said, there's seldom a couple that doesn't one day wake up in their marriage 5-7 years into the marriage and think about that person laying in bed with them and think, what have I done? And that's the problem, is that most people at one time in their marriage think, what have I done? Is this the right person? And too many times nowadays, at that point is when a person says, I'm out of here. Whereas 50 years ago, there was the feeling of, when you get to that point, you say to yourself, I need to figure this out. I need to work on this. I need to improve. And spiritually, when you think about things biblically, there's the passage, and this doesn't mean to be one way or the other, but Peter tells wives, if you're married to an unbeliever, try to influence him to be a believer. He doesn't say hit the road and tell him to hit the road. But we have more of an idea that if you're married to somebody and things aren't working out, what do people say? Well, you know, the most important thing is fill in the blank.
Your happiness.
You're happy.
Your happiness.
That's the most important thing today is
Your
you're happy.
happiness, right.
Not
Well, we've become a very
that your
selfish,
children
right.
grow up to
Right.
be godly people or to be productive people or that the children are secure. The most important thing is
Your
you're happy. And we live in this society where that's a little crazy.
Well, let me pose something to you, and I've thought this, I've let this rumble through my mind ever since we started passing this law that people were compelled to go to a class to get a divorce, right? I mean, you have to, if you want a divorce and you have kids, you have to go to this class. My first thought is, why aren't we doing that on the front end?
On the front end.
Why aren't you required to do a class before you get your marriage certificate by the state of Tennessee? Why don't you have a class in which you go over, even just from a legal perspective? Because I have people to come in with me and they get a divorce. And let's say one of them has worked for 10 or 15 years and they have a 401k. The other one is just on a spending binge every other weekend. And so they've run up $10,000 in credit card bills. And I have to say to the saver, you understand this, you have to say to the saver, you know, I really hate it for you, but all that hard work you've done to save all that retirement is going to be split. And they're like, whoa, no, that's my money. I'm like, no, it's not. Because once you become a marriage partnership under the eyes of the law, there are certain things that go into play. One of them is the financial partnership by law. One of them is the whole inheritance issues. Of course, having children. Alimony. Alimony is a legal requirement that once you enter into a marriage contract, you're out of control. The government's in control of that. So we need to think really serious as a society of, I think, making it harder to get married, maybe making it easier to get divorced.
I heard about someone one time, and this is just something I'll throw out there, that, you know, when you go through a divorce, you go into this parenting plan, and the judge says, here's the way it's going to happen, and the child will be with mom for a certain period of time, and dad for a certain period of time. And the decision was made, I don't know if the judge made it or who, that here's the house, there's the kid's bedroom, mom will live there for a certain period of time, then dad will come in and live there for a certain period of time, but the child stays put. And then mom and dad were like, hold on, that's a little bit too disruptive to my lifestyle.
Yeah, I've
And the
actually
judge-
done that. I've made that ruling. It's been a few years ago, and I don't think that it had ever been done in Hardin County before. But it was unique because the parties were a little bit more financially able to do that. But it really, I felt like, worked much better for the children. It was far less disruptive for them. It really put the onus on the parents to be moving, and they could realize how difficult it is for their children to do that. But it allowed them to stay in the residence that they grew up in, go to the same school districts. So it was far less onerous to the children. The attorneys hated it, the parties hated it, but I think that they resolved their divorce more amicably after that.
Right.
I think that's the key. When people hear that, I've told people that before, people think like, that's crazy. That's so disruptive to who? Because we do it every day to kids,
adults,
and we think,
right.
kids are resilient, they'll get through this. But we don't want to do that to real people.
Right.
You know, people that have jobs and stuff like that. So.
And you know, I will say, and you know, I'm not a social worker and I'm not a psychologist, but I am a unique attorney in that I did my master's work in psychology before I entered law school. And you know, I look all the time at children, and I say the first 10 years of a children's life is about safety and security. They need to know what to expect, who they can trust, where their home is, what their schedule is. I mean, and even just as moms raising children and seeing children grow up, you can see that phase where children go through that they need to know what day they go to school, and they're asking you every day, do I go to school tomorrow or is it not? So really providing consistency and security to that child, at least that first 10 years, is so vitally important.
You know, a couple of things, you know, that you've touched on is one of the first things is that, you know, marriage is a contract. You know, and that's how, as a society, we view that. You know, that, I mean, legally, it's a contract. But the truth is, marriage is a covenant. I mean, and that's what we really don't talk about that it's a covenant. And families, you know, I think that's where they lose out. The second thing is that, you know, I have families ask me all the time, well, what's the best, you know, what age is the best age for your children to get a divorce? The answer to that is never.
Yeah.
You know, never. I mean, truly children, from the ages of, birth until middle school. Kids do. They need stability. They need to know what's going to happen. But teenagers need that as well. I mean, to get a divorce when someone's child is a teenager, I mean, that's a very hard time in a child's life. They who do they trust? Their peer group is already looked at as their family. Well, if you get a divorce when your children are teenagers, that really makes you even less important to them, and their peer group even more important to them. And that does a lot of damage, for children as well. One of the things that I think is really good, though, with the parenting classes that is required for divorcing parents is we look at the grief process. And I think nobody has ever looked at the grief process in divorce. Those of us that have been through divorce know that you do grieve. Even if you think you're going to be happy, there is a grief process that you go through. But your children go through that. Your children go through the grief process as well. When I teach that class, and have been teaching it for 15 years, and one of the things that we talk about is what is the grief process and what do your children go through. It's funny because I'll say to families as they're there, and lots of times we encourage, some counties don't, and I think in Kentucky you all don't allow, you don't want parents to come together.
No, we don't encourage that.
We do in our office when we do the parenting classes, because we feel like, how are you going to parent your children for the rest of your lives if you can't sit across the table from each other for 4 hours? It's a 4-hour parenting class. But I'll say to families, where are you at in the grief process? And they're like, well, this is great. We're not in grief. We're wonderful. Where are your children?
Denial.
Exactly, denial. Exactly. It's denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and finally acceptance. They're in denial. And that's what I tell them. They're like, oh, this is great. We're not in the grief process. Well, you're in denial. And then the other thing I say is, where are your children? Where are your children in the grief process? And they go, well, they're doing great.
Denial.
Well, denial. Right,
Well, what I found too is because I have to interview children, especially if they're older children or sometimes not even that old. I've interviewed children as young as 4 and 5, and it's always a difficult thing. In fact, I think for me personally, that's probably the hardest aspect to my job is to interview children in a divorce setting.
Yes.
But so many times I see where parents try to influence the children. They're really coaching them, sometimes even coercing them to say certain things. Make sure you tell the judge that Daddy did this or Mommy didn't do that, and they're always putting their children in the middle. They don't really understand how that affects that child or children emotionally. It can scar them, and they're so caught up in the emotional aspect of the divorce, the hurt of the divorce, the betrayal that they may feel from that other spouse in a divorce, that they just need to step back and reflect. And I do agree that I think the parenting classes that we mandate that they take before the decree is entered, and the children have to go through a class too, so they will understand that Mommy and Daddy still love you, but Mommy and Daddy, for whatever reason, just can't live together. That's it in a nutshell. Of course, it's reduced to something on their level, of course.
Which we're missing in Tennessee.
We've had that for quite some time in Kentucky, and I think it helps. And sometimes I see parents that they need more than that. So many times I will order counseling, parenting classes. I've ordered mental health assessments. I've ordered custodial evaluations. It really depends upon the severity and what I hear in any particular case. Some parents just need more than that very basic that they would get in our parenting class that is mandated by our local rules.
Right.
One of the things that I think that people miss, and people that are going through the divorce, I hope they can get this from our discussion, is that divorce is an anxiety-producing, a mind screwing up, to coin the term, situation. I'm a very logical, rational thinking person. When I went through my first divorce, the worst one, the gut-wrenching one.
Right. Because you had children.
Well, yes, and because it was new and something that when I first got married, I thought this is, for life. It affected my mind to where all of my logic went out the window, all my rationality went out the window. I thought things, I did things that no rational person would do. I had this person leaving me, and in my mind, I thought, well, I'll just make this so hard that she'll want to come back. And what kind of person thinks those things? So those people that are going through a divorce need to realize that you need to listen to people, because when they tell you you're not acting right, you're probably not acting right.
Well, Dan, I want to tell you something again from the psychology standpoint, and maybe not so much from the lawyer standpoint, but as humans, two of the largest emotions, or the largest things that we have as humans, is trust and betrayal. And I always tell clients when they come in and they talk to me and about, they get real vengeful about somebody having an affair or doing something, I talk to them about betrayal. And I said, if you don't think betrayal is a big deal, read the Bible.
Yeah.
I said, so, it is, when we are betrayed, we are totally helpless. And we feel like we must act out. And, and I spend time talking to people about that. And I also spend time talking to them about the grief. And then the other thing I tell them about the grief process for children, there's another stage in there for children, which is helplessness. Because the children have no ability to control the situation. And when I have somebody sitting in my office that's 35, 40, 45 years old, and they have young children, I say, I want you for a minute to take yourself back to being 5 years old. You depended on adults for everything in your life. You depended on adults for what you eat, what you wear, where you lay your head down, who got you to the doctor. I mean, you can't, as an adult, now go back and psychologically reinvent yourself as a 5-year-old. And you've got to remember that that child needs to be able to maintain the security that comes from trusting the adults who are in charge.
Now, we've talked all around this about divorce and on the children. And we talked about affecting children. What effect have you seen in courts and in the adoption? You've worked a lot with children. What effect have you seen in the last generation has this had on children in America? Have we seen a big difference that's having on family, and especially in children and the families?
I think, one of the things that Tennessee is really beginning, and I'm not sure about Kentucky, is, I'll talk a little bit about it, it's adverse childhood experiences. That is really, Tennessee's really beginning to understand that the adverse childhood experiences that people have during their childhood, early in their childhood, affect you. Not only do they affect you emotionally, but they also affect your physical health. And the amount of money that's being poured into the healthcare system, really and truly, if we would start early and start looking at families early and adverse experiences that children have, such as divorce, such as alcoholism, such as domestic abuse, all of those things that children experience early on in their beginning years of their life, even as infants, have an effect on them, their emotional health, but more importantly, the millions of dollars that are being poured into the healthcare system right now because of illnesses, high blood pressure, cardiac disease, mental illness, of course, really are tied back now, they're finding, to adverse childhood experiences. And I think Tennessee is just really beginning now to really begin to look at that. And I'm not sure about Kentucky, Pam, is that something that's being talked about in Kentucky?
Yes, it is.
I think so.
Well, let me add, adverse childhood experiences are Beyonce and Jay-Z.
Yes,
and
yes,
so,
yes,
we
exactly,
have,
exactly.
we have this, this whole mishmash of things that are adversely affecting a child's ability to have healthy relationships, to know how to communicate, and for conflict resolution, things that should all be taught in school. And that we are not teaching children, we're not teaching humans, we're not teaching them how to resolve conflicts.
So what I hear you saying is these things affect children, and then the breakup of the family sort of cascades because as much as people want to make fun of Andy Griffith and Opie, Andy had some times when he sat down with Opie and taught him some things. And when you have these children whose families are breaking up, they don't have those times with their family learning those things and being taught about honor and trustworthiness, and you don't lie and you don't steal and you don't cheat and you're honorable and you're loyal. They don't have their parents teaching these things, and they lose all of those foundational things that parents teach them.
And I think that's an interesting choice, because if you stop and think about that, Andy Griffith was actually raising Opie as a single father.
Right.
the
family
mother
life.
had died. Of course, they had Aunt B, who
B,
was like the mother figure. But what was interesting about that versus what we see so many times today, there was a moral component.
Right.
Andy was taking the time to talk to his child and was trying to set a good moral example, trying to be a role model. And sometimes, we kind of talk very generically about why marriages fail, but there's also a far more complex layering to that, because oftentimes you have domestic violence, you have drug issues, you have
Right.
so many more issues that are facing the contemporary family that is heightened much more today than it was even 25 years ago or 20 years ago or even 15 years ago. So, and a lot of these parents just do not have proper parenting skills. Maybe they weren't taught it. For whatever reason, they don't have the parenting skills as exemplified by the character of Andy Griffith. I mean,
Right.
You have the person who was the role model for not only his son but the community. A lot of parents that I see would not be considered a role model by any stretch of the imagination, sadly.
So not only do you not have the Andy Griffith or the Ward Cleaver or the Make Room for Daddy or all these Father Knows Best, all these people teaching their children, then you have the child that doesn't know these things, then they grow up,
Correct.
then they have children.
a
So it
cycle.
just keeps on cascading downward and downward.
And I think you've hit on the one thing is the missing father, because
Okay.
I do feel like that is
Yes,
a big
and-
component in the
And that's
breakdown.
a huge component
it
in
is a
some of the
huge
inner
component.
cities where even the government
Right.
even promotes that missing father.
Right.
Well, and
Yes.
there's a lot of statistics that show that there's a higher juvenile crime rate for children that are raised by single mothers, and that's unfortunate. But that's not true of every case. I mean, there's certainly examples where men and women raise their children and they do a good job. But the general rule is that that's not the ideal situation, and statistics have borne that out.
Okay. We appreciate you all being here. We're going to have to ask you all to come back if you can. We're going to do another show, talk some more about adoption and some more about the family, some of your experiences. We appreciate everyone joining us today. These have been some great comments by our ladies who have so much experience in this field. We hope you'll come back and join us again as we talk more with VeritasPopuli, Truth for the People. Join us again next time. Thank you very much.